like to start the Q&A by asking Jean a question. I read that you studied poetry therapy in the States. So I wonder if you could say whereabouts in the States you did this and what your course consisted of.
Yes, of course. Actually, a friend of mine, I see that's on the Zoom here, suggested that I do the course. It was in Washington. It was under Professor Jerry Chavis, and she's a poetry therapist. And I had been giving writing courses around Mayo and in Inishbofin, and a friend of mine, Ruth, suggested that I worked like a guy called John Fox, an American guy. And I thought I was just doing my own thing. So I rang John Fox, and he answered the phone, couldn't believe it. And we started to talk, and he is a poetry therapist. And I thought, God, you know, there's a whole organization doing what I just do. So every time John Fox came to Ireland, I did workshops under him. And then his colleague, Jerry Chavis, came. And every time she came, I did her workshops as well. And I thought, you know, this is my tribe. This is my community. It's poetry for writing for healing, poetry for healing. And so I began the training, which meant I would facilitate groups here and have a weekly conversation with Jerry. This is prior to the internet, you know, prior to Zoom and prior to WhatsApp phone calls. And then I went to Washington for 2 weeks for 2 courses. So it was between my phone calls, between Jerry coming over and my going over. It took years. That sounds simple, but it actually took about 7 years.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
And was this about facilitating poetry as therapy for other people, or was it for yourself?
Well, I was diagnosed with MS in 1997. I was a teacher of English in a secondary school, and my life just fell apart. And I found myself turning to writing as a way of passing the night. I didn't sleep for years. So it saved my life like that. So the training was to offer to people what had worked for me, just spilling it onto the page. You know, I would call myself a writing facilitator, not a writing therapist. You know, I feel that's a very specific training. Even though my training is called writing therapist, I think I'd need a bigger background. I've just done a diploma in counselling. I wouldn't think that's enough. So it's just putting it all on the page and giving it a shape. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And Ronna, could I ask you more or less the same question? I believe you trained as a psychotherapist, and I was wondering what the difference for you was between working as a psychotherapist and then doing your healthcare work that you do, facilitating poetry for people in the hospital settings.
Yeah, I can. So when I was working as a psychotherapist, the focus was on, well, it was first of all, it was usually more long-term work. So I would work with someone over a period of years, and they would be telling me about like a particular issue that was blocking them, troubling them. So they could be depressed, or there might have been a trauma in their life, and I was in the service of helping them to have more access to their experience and to work through their history that was difficult. It was very focused on their individual sort of coming to themselves as whole people. And I didn't use poetry unless, and occasionally I would, if it seemed like there was something a poem could say better than I could say, and with more space around it. And I was always careful that I was choosing to do poetry, not because I wanted poetry in the room, but because it would hopefully be a powerful intervention. So I was really careful about that. And so my poetry was kind of in the background, even though people often knew that I was a poet, and some even came because of that. Um, when I stopped being a therapist, there was a transition. I I knew from working with clients and from friends that when I would share poems that I'd written with friends, it would have an impact on them. And as Jean said, it also, you know, it helped me sort of live through a whole lot of stuff that I didn't have any way to, you know, process. But when I shifted, I worked at the University of Toronto Counseling and Learning Skills Services. I brought a poem into a staff meeting, and staff meetings are notoriously, you know, boring and horrible. And I brought it in because this was a particular staff meeting I had to facilitate, and I was very nervous. And I needed this poem just to get me through. And my colleagues were very accommodating, and they, you know, they didn't mind. I read it for myself and carried on with the meeting. And after that, I went on leave for several months to work on a book. And one of my colleagues said, "Will you be coming in to give us a poem?" And I was so surprised because I had thought that it was just for me. And I didn't really understand or get what it was doing for other people who were strangers, for a one-off, like for a 5-minute hit. And so from that perspective, I began to explore what it could offer, and developed something at the University of Toronto called Poet in Community, which was a program that ran there for 15 years, using poetry to sort of facilitate workshops that were not therapy, and they were not educational. Like, I mean, they weren't graded in any way. They were just to sort of give people a place to explore the confluence of all the parts of themselves. Because so often, you know, we're siloed. This, you know, here's a chemistry student and here's a Muslim, but they're not like connected, but we carry all the parts around. So the hospital work was just, you know, a trajectory of that, of using the poems, yes, also to lead workshops with staff, also to write people poems on the spot in spontaneous poetry booths, but they were kind of like little nuggets. They were little moments that might offer people either an opening within themselves to explore in their writing, or a gift of a poem that might articulate something they were experiencing. But they weren't like, you know, they weren't therapy. They wasn't like working with someone, and it was no longer setting myself up with that level of responsibility or expectation, or setting them up to expect anything like that. It was just a tiny little offering. It still exists, it's still what I do, and I love doing it.
So the other work that you've done in hospitals, when you put on a white coat, I understand. And it's as if poetry is a prescription. I mean, how do you go about that?
Okay. Yes. So that is called, that is called RX for poetry. I don't know if they have that in Scotland and Europe. It's not called RX. What is it called when you have a prescription? Is there like a code for that?
You know,
Anyway,
sorry.
like when you get a slip, like a little slip with a prescription on it.
I just call it a prescription.
A prescription. Okay,
I may
okay.
be ignorant.
So in North America, RX is like a little, I don't know what it stands for. I know that one of my friends in the audience will know that, Jonathan. Somebody must know. But anyway, it's just a code. So essentially, if I was there, I would call it something else. A prescriptions for poetry is what it is. And I instead of writing the poems on the spot, which is how it started, the spontaneous poetry booth would be where I'd sit at a table with a sign that says the poet is in, like Lucy and Charlie Brown. And people would come over and I would ask, what do you need a poem for? And then we would talk and I would ask them questions. And when I got the first line, we stop talking and I write the poem. Good or bad, I give it to them. And the second iteration is this RX, or prescriptions for poetry, which I developed because it felt a little bit too intense, a little too on the nose to be writing people poems about themselves while in the hospital waiting room. Like a little bit too, it was one thing to evoke feeling, but this just felt too close. So the idea of the prescriptions was that I gathered what I called my medicine chest of poems, which was a collection of poems by poets like Emily Dickinson or Langston Hughes or Mary Oliver or some of my own poems, and they were already printed on pieces of paper. And I would ask the same question. I'd go in my white coat because I was the poet in residence, and it had this kind of playfulness, right? Because what's she doing here, this poet in the white coat? And I would, work with the playfulness to invite people who were interested to sit, and I would ask, would you like a poem? And often people would say, no, I'm fine, but other people would be curious, and then they'd sit, and it would be a bit disarming, the playfulness of the coat. But then I'd ask the question, same question, what do you need a poem for? And invariably, people would, if we sat for a minute or two, even if any of you sit with the question for a minute, what do you need a poem for right now? You might actually feel something. And then if we talked about that for a few minutes, then I would go look in the prescription chest and choose a poem that might fit, or a few poems. I could pick many. And then I would read it to them. And if it worked, I'd be able to see. It was never a head thing, right? It was never like, oh, I think that works. I knew that wasn't it. You know how poetry works. It's just like a treatment. It just hits you like smell or something. It's right in your body. And then it worked. If it worked, it worked. And they would go away with the prescription.
That's fascinating. Thank you
Fine.
very much. I'm going to turn to Jean now and ask similar questions. When you are facilitating your writing workshops for others, so unlike Ronna, who's writing a poem for them, you are getting them to write their own poems, yes? So how do you get your students to protect themselves? I mean, in a sense, like the asbestos gloves that are necessary when dealing with hot material. What methods do you use? Do you teach them?
First of all, I'd love to have gone to one of Ronna's when she's a white coat on and asked for a poem. I think that's a lovely idea. Well, if it's if it's just a writing group, that's okay. But if it's a special group, first of all, we'd set up a confidentiality contract. What says what's written in the room stays in the room, that kind of obvious stuff. And I would begin very, very slowly. I wouldn't begin head on. I'd like it to be over a series of weeks. So we begin with very gentle exercises, building them up. So the first few exercises people wouldn't read, it'd just be confidential. We'd go around, and then after that, I'd say, would anybody like to read? And generally, I find a feeling of trust just arises. I think because I trust what I'm doing, it seems to build an atmosphere of trust in the room. It's worked to date, and I hope it continues to do so. I don't go head on. I approach kind of sideways and gently. So I would, like Ronna, I would have I've batches and batches. I've been doing this for a long time, so I've built up a huge collection of poems that I can rely on, and then I play music, or I have a word box, pick a random word, and people might use that word and just go somewhere that they weren't expecting to go. I like to kind of get people to be surprised themselves as to where they end up. But it's slowly, it's a gradual build-up of trust. And then people are usually pleased at the end because they've got a piece of work, they've got a poem or a bit of flash fiction or a bit of a short story and got something off their chest at the same time.
Yes.
Mm.
I'm interested in whether they are just spilling out their feelings
Mhm.
or whether you are showing them in some way how to turn this into poetry.
It's both, actually. A lot of people would come back to my sessions over the years. You know, I've been doing this for over 20 years. So I would bring in poems and some craft suggestions. And we, you know, based on the poem I've given, I might ask them to try something in similar fashion. But just through repeated turn up, I think people find their own ways. Some people don't like to write poetry, they prefer to write prose. I'm not really teaching them, I'm just allowing it to happen. That makes sense. And by being exposed to other people's work, by reading it, I think people kind of learn from that.
And I was interested thinking about your own work
Mm-hmm.
as kind of self-healing, especially in terms of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Your father and your
Mhm.
mother and
Mhm.
your friend Margaret Murray. I loved the phrase "we speak in birds"
Mm-hmm.
and "we speak in mother" that
Mhm.
you use, which is kind of like a metaphor, isn't it? Is this how you protect yourself, by using metaphor in your poetry?
That's what I tried to do. Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, my father died a good few years ago, and I wrote during his illness and after his illness, and I'm still writing about him. He pops into poems every now and again, whereas my mother's death is recent, and I just can't seem to really include her in the work at all. I think I haven't the energy, the emotional energy to do it. Whereas for my father, I don't know why, he just, and was equally close to the two of them, he fell into everything that I wrote. I didn't expect that to happen. I thought I'd be writing about my mother every 5 minutes, but I just don't seem to have the energy. I seem to want to go for a swim or go for a walk, or I just
But
can't see.
maybe it's a question of time.
Yeah, I think it probably
Maybe
is. Yeah,
several
I was
years.
hugely involved in her care, so that's probably it.
Yes,
But
yes.
she loved poetry, and it was a great bond for the two of us. Yeah, it was lovely to share that with her.
So sometimes poetry is not a help in self-healing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised, because when I was diagnosed with MS, it saved my life. You know, I didn't know where to put myself, and everything came out in the shape of a poem or on the page. And same with my father. But this time, I seem to just hit a full stop. I have the odd one, but not as I expected.
Yes.
I have to accept that, you know.
I've just started writing poems about my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she died, well, my son is, what is he? 33.
Mm-hmm.
And she died when I was pregnant with him. So it's taken me like over 30 years to be able to write about her. So maybe, in 30 years' time,
I
you'll be
expect
able
that
to.
will. I expect it to be something like that.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for sharing those. I mean, turning back to Ronna, how do you protect yourself when you're writing your own poems about self-healing? I've noticed that a lot of your poems have a sense of humor. Is that what it is?
Um, I actually want to say that my aim is to not protect myself. Yes, your face. Yes, because I think that's where the goods are, and I think that's also where I'm heading in terms of just as a person wanting to live more freely in awareness, is that the protection is never any protection. Protection doesn't. There's no protection in protection. Um, I mean, there are places where with other people I have boundaries, but in terms of writing, my aim, and then I can decide if I want to publish it or not, but and when I'm ready and all that stuff. But the intention is just to open, like, let myself potentially hear what, well, as I said at the beginning, what poetry might have wisdom that I don't. And if I actually try to imagine what I need, I can't even know what I need to protect myself from, while I'm writing it. So I want to allow myself to at least hear what it might have in store for me and then make choices.
I think I was thinking about how does one write about something that is just so awful that one almost doesn't have the words or the courage to do it. And
Yes.
of course, the cliche, it's become a cliche now, creative writing teachers say, come at it slant. I mean, that was Emily Dickinson, wasn't it, who said that? I mean,
I think for
you
me
find
in
that
that,
helpful?
I just, I think that the system does its own thing. So if I don't have the words, there won't be a poem, and I have had, and so here is emotion coming because I'm a big crier, and so don't be freaked out, any of you, if I start to tear up here. But I have not been able to write about the war, the crisis, the horror in the Middle East,
Mm.
And that's disturbing to me. But it's disturbing what's happening, and I have no words. I can't seem to write about it. So it's not like I'm trying to protect myself. It's just that until there are words, there are no words. And then when there are words, I just want to hear them so desperately if they have something useful for me. So I think that the protection comes somehow, and maybe as you said too, there's humor. The humor just comes. I don't plan it. It just comes out. It's just how I work, and it does seem like it's just it's everywhere. It just kind of flies in there, and I'm glad for that because
Well,
I
it
like to laugh.
helps the audience, doesn't it? It brings people
Yes,
in. Yeah.
yeah. I mean that Bukowski poem. I mean, I love that there's humor in there. So.
Yeah. So are you meaner now? Meaner and
Am I
funny.
meaner? I don't know. You'll have to read my book and tell me if you think I'm getting meaner as I go. I
Yeah,
love that. I love that as a goal.
that's great advice. I'm going to pause now and ask Mila do we have any questions in the chat?
We do. We have two. The first one was by Kate, but I'm not sure. Maybe she feels it has already been answered, but I will. So, Kate, do you still have your question? Do you want to ask it, or are you good?
Hi, I'm Kate, also from Toronto. In a way, yes, I think it was asked, but I'm wondering, Ronna, if you do workshops with the healthcare providers themselves so that they are learning the craft of poetry writing, or as an expression of their own life experience, their pain, their confusion, everything else that goes into being a healthcare provider. And if this is, you spoke about boundaries, and so I'm wondering how you integrate, the necessity of boundaries, both as a writer, but also as a healthcare practitioner. If that, if it's different in any way than working in any other setting with any other group of people.
I don't think that the boundaries are different, but let me just try to come back to the first question. I think you said, how do I work with healthcare providers to facilitate a workshop, facilitate a workshop with? I don't think it's very much different from any other kind of workshop. I just came back from, I want to tell you where I came from so that you can Google it later because it's so far north. I just came back from the Sioux Lookout. I don't mean you particularly, Kate. I mean anybody. It's very far northern Ontario, the Sioux Lookout. And I went up to work with doctors who go to fly-in communities of First Nations people where there are no roads and they fly in by planes. And I was doing a retreat with them. They had an annual retreat. And what I do with healthcare providers, which is similar to what I do with others, but I guess it's torqued to them, is I develop a workshop around what their needs are. So I'll meet with the host who wants me to come, and I'll find out what the community needs that at that point, and I will develop a workshop around that, and I'll go and do it. So it will be a theme. Like this group, you know, they were very, I mean, doctors everywhere are stressed out, but these folks particularly, because they're alone. I mean, they're together in this community. When I come there, went there, they were together, but they don't really have colleagues. They're flying off to all these remote communities, and they're alone doing this very difficult work. And they wanted something which I think a lot of communities want, which is about kind of coming home to their own experience, from being so full of being scrambled and running around, and doctors are constantly moving forward to respond. So all the poems, I work in a very similar way to Jean, and the poems that I choose, you know, to come at their experience sort of sideways and gently and gradually through a workshop to build a kind of momentum that they have gone through some kind of a process for themselves that starts a little bit easier and then drops them somewhere that they're actually going to explore something, and then takes them sort of to a place where they can rest with it, that it's not so intense. And depending on what they want, the workshop could be geared very specifically around healthcare. I have a number of workshops, you know, that are focused on healthcare. There was one called Have You Seen the Patient? There was one called Postcards from the Edge, which was about writing about COVID and compassion fatigue. So they're geared for different needs. But and in terms of the boundaries, it's the same. I'm very conscious that I let people know this isn't therapy. Things will come up. There's room for feelings, and I have a whole lot of things I say around to make space for people to have room for their feelings, while somehow making a little bit of a container so they don't feel blown out of the water by them. So it is a little bit of a balancing act, you know, all the time. And you know, you can't predict anything. Thank you. Sorry if that was too long an answer.
Not at all. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I have one more question for Ronna from Brenda, and then there's two questions for Jean, one from me and one from Doreen, and I think that will wrap up our Q&A. But Brenda, you had a question for Ronna.
Yes, hi. Thank you both for such beautiful work. Ronna, you said something about when you're doing the spontaneous poetry and you're in a room with a person, that some of the poems are good and some of them are bad. What do you mean when you're making that distinction? What's a bad poem?
No, I think that, like, thank you for picking that up. I think what I meant to say was that when I'm doing the writing, I really want to be not looking at whether it's good or bad. I really want to be out of my judging mind completely, so that I can just try to hear what they've said and to hear what words are coming, so that the questions of good and bad are not even in there. And the goal is that it's a service or an offering or a gift or something. So all I want to do is to try to feel, and I can usually feel it if I feel like there's some germ of truth in this, and that if it has some energy and some rhythm and that it feels a little bit like a poem, that's okay. And in truth, there's so much happening in those poetry booths that even if it doesn't even sound like a poem, even if it just sounds like a lot of paraphrasing, in some ways that may be all that's enough, because I've listened to some stranger who wouldn't have had that experience before. So it's quite a forgiving process. So I want to back away from all of that, like, judgy language. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Wonderful, thanks. So Jean, I have a question for you, and then Doreen, if you are okay with that, your question will conclude the Q&A. What I was wondering, Jean, I think in your introduction you said that even though poetry touches on things that are, that we, as humans we experience many times, it's still fresh, like grief. I mean, and I agree. I have that same experience, but also as an editor of a poetry magazine back in the day, there are also lots of poems that are repeating the experience. That so they're very personal and they're describing an experience, but they are not fresh in a sense. And I wondered, and maybe you touched on it a little bit, but in your retreat, do you I don't want to say push, but do you sort of encourage people to find a fresh look, or is it okay to if it's their personal truth and they are happy with what they wrote? So how do you deal with that?
Oh yeah, I don't push people to look for a fresh approach, no, because I suppose I offer different type of writing sessions, but it's really what everybody wants to bring to the table themselves, even though that sounds like a cliche. So there are some very people that really, really want to write really good poetry that attend the groups, and that's their business. And there's other people that just like to come and write and express themselves. So I don't put any rules or agenda or requirements. No, I just want people to enjoy being in the space and let it happen.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I think that ties into Doreen's question.
Yes, that's right. Hello, Jean.
Hi.
Tell us, please, where we can find out about your retreats.
Yeah. Well, the one I was just talking about there is in Ishboffin. It's through the Linen Hall Arts Centre. So if you Google the Linen Hall Arts Centre in Castlebar, they advertise it. It's happening this year in September, but they usually advertise it around June. And actually, it books up quickly, nothing necessarily to do with me, but Inishbofin is a beautiful island and people like to go there. And I only take 10 people on the course. So if you Google the Linen Hall, I work also through the Family Centre in Castlebar. So if you look up,
Could you just put that name in the chat, please? It's the spelling of it.
The Linen Hall, I can write it in myself, is it? The Linen Hall is LINENHALL, the Linen Hall
Okay.
Arts Centre.
Oh, okay, thanks. And how long was the September one?
It's for a week, 5
Okay.
mornings, something like the 9th of September, the Monday, something like the 9th of September.
Okay, I'll have a look. I'll Google them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks so much. So please give a big hand to Jean and Ronna for this wonderful Q&A and beautiful readings.